Okay, I'm gonna start us, and I want to sort of start just by shouting that back because Madron's just done such a wonderful job organizing this for us all. And this body of work, especially for me, has felt really solitary. Like my studio coming out of grad school, moving from a space where I was working really closely with all the other makers around me, constantly bouncing ideas off each other, and then moving into my home studio where it's just sort of like me on my kitchen table making things. And so getting a chance to take the work out of that space where it really was just in my mind and my heart and in my hands, and then bring it to this space so other people can get to see it, that's exciting because it feels like it's sort of the final step towards it being really real and really realized. I want to start by talking about these hanging wearable vests that are actually all behind you. and I want to talk about just sort of the process of how those came about because that did start in grad school. And so I worked with 4 different people who I knew and I was close with in school who each was about to embark, as so many of us are, whether we're in grad school or undergrad, in a big move in their life, whether that's out of a conservative place into a liberal place, the opposite, maybe just moving out of their family home for the first time, and talking with each of them about what would make it possible for them to move through that moment, feeling like they could continue to be the authentic self that they found while being in sort of the safe haven of the university environment. And so each one is for a person with those sort of symbols on it that hopefully will help bring them, when they physically wear the piece, the things that they were hoping to bring with them through that transition period. So it's odd to make something that's for another person for a gift, as a gift, and then show that work to everybody. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that as people are able to see these pieces in a public setting, they're able to imagine putting those things on themselves and feeling like they themselves can become kind of enrobed in whatever protective feeling might that they might need in that moment. So like the one that I really want to talk about is sort of the one that looks the most like a knight. So it's that silvery gray one. The cloth itself would go down past the knees of the person that it's for. Their whole head would be kind of covered and enrobed by the cloth of the hood itself. And it has this sort of badge with different symbols on it from folk tales and fairy tales about growing strong and knowing who you are. And when I was making that piece, one of the sort of references I kept thinking about was the leaded vest that you get put on you when you're at the dentist. So you go to the dentist, right, which is already a stressful experience for me personally, and then they're gonna like shoot all these x-rays at you. And in that moment, you're given this object that is gonna protect you from this sort of environmental hazard, right? So this thing is put on you to protect your body. And so I was hoping to kind of pull some of those same references so that when Chico wore this piece, they would feel like they were being given a protective garment to wear, even if the outside environment becomes kind of dangerous for them, right? And not only is it the symbols on there that we talked about together, the shape of the object itself, but also just the knowledge that it was made by me and stitched by me for them, I hope imbues it just like with that much more meaning for them when they wear it. Yeah, and so this piece was wonderful, this set of 4, because it felt like for a long time in grad school, I had this feeling of like, oh, like in this moment, we're all being so perfectly held by our community, and then we're all gonna move away from this place. And yes, go on to make wonderful lives for ourselves, but also that moment I had this feeling of like, oh, if only I could just like find a way to wrap my arms around this space for us so that we could continue to feel safe here. And so this is my way of kind of expanding that space. So hopefully wherever they are, they're having that same feeling of the community that we had there. So kind of shifting gears, the other piece of mine that's in this space are these 2 wall hanging pieces. So originally I was a ceramic artist, and I made all of my work out of ceramics, and I've really been moving dramatically towards cloth, as you can see in this work that I made for this show. But figuring out how those two things have a relationship with each other, the clay and the cloth, putting them together in different ways has been really gratifying. One of the reasons I like them both is they're both so tactile and so familiar. And so in this piece, sort of having the contrast of the hand quilted inner fabric with the pinched clay on the outer fabric, there's this same sort of compression that's happening in both of the actual materials that sort of mimic and can kind of bounce off each other. This piece here that's closest to me with the green on the outside and the sort of interior organ, which is that big expansive shape, that piece is called A Charm Against Loneliness and Sitting With It. I teach high schoolers now, and being a teenager is such a difficult moment in so many of our lives. I think part of that is that teenagers are sitting uncomfortably between their childhood selves and their fully realized self. And it's easy to see that in a teenager as they sort of stumble over existing in both of those worlds at once. But I think the loneliness that can come from not being fully aligned internally can follow us into adulthood. And so finding a way to really truly exist, sit with your internal self, is the charm that piece is trying to kind of communicate to everybody. And yeah, I feel so grateful to get to show this work alongside these two amazing other projects that I'm excited for you to hear about. And that's what I want to share. Thanks.
Yay. Thanks, Emily. Yeah. I wrote something because I am someone who will, if given the time, will just babble and yabble for forever. So I'm going to be reading. But I first just wanted to say hi, and thank you guys for being here. It means a lot. My name is Claudia Hermano. I use they, them pronouns. And to introduce myself, my mother was born in New Jersey as the granddaughter of Italian immigrants, and she soon moved to Greenwich Village and grew up there and in Westchester, New York. My father was born in Iloilo in the Philippines, and he moved to Queens when he was 19 years old. They met in Midtown in 1991. They fell in love, got married, had my sibling, who's actually in my piece, and then had me. And I was born in New York. I moved every 2 or 3 years until I was about 17, and I lived in New York, California, Texas, Massachusetts, and cities, suburbs, apartments, hotels, and houses. And after childhood, once I had a little bit more choice in my life, I spent most of my life in the Northeast, but in 2021, I moved here to Albuquerque to get my MFA in photography from UNM. And I graduated in 2024, and in the same year, I was awarded the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund Resiliency Residency, which has supported the development of the work that you see here, over to my left and your right, which is called After All This Dying We Have Done. The constant moving that I experienced as a child instilled in me a very deep sense that home isn't a place, it's with people. I learned to locate ideas of safety and comfort not in physical spaces, but in relationships. And this corporeality of safety is critical to how I think about myself and my artistic work. This project and my entire practice is shaped by a desire to be in relationship, to witness, to be seen, to see, and kind of to never be alone. I explore embodiment, identity, and presence through portraiture, and I use photography to think through complexity of being and how we come to know ourselves and each other through the materiality and the politics of identity. So my work is grounded in body politics, queer theory, and racial studies. I'm interested in the ways that identities are shaped and held and transformed through choice and chance, pressure and love and time and bodies. And so After All This Dying We Have Done is a documentation of camaraderie and gender. It's about being non-binary and dictating the terms of how you're seen. And it shows the experience of being in a body that is often in resistance to pre-existing scaffoldings of identity. And so for this project, I worked with medium format film to create these collaborative portraits of fellow non-binary people. And every image begins with a conversation. I sit down with each person and we talk about privacy, refusal, and gender, and I ask, how do you see yourself? What does it mean? What does being seen mean to you? What does it mean to be looked at, to be captured in an image, and to control how that happens? So then we use that conversation to build a portrait together. Sometimes that looks like someone in their bedroom or outside or in a place they love. Sometimes it's highly constructed or very pared down. And the important part and consistency through all of these images is that we're doing it together. It's not about me imposing a vision on someone, it's about me listening and hearing. And the images are visual translations of my communion with these people, and each one is as unique as the person that's pictured. And so over the past 4 years before I started developing this work, I have been developing a separate body of work that explores body size and gender and race as social constructs and challenges dominant ideas of identity and embodiment. And that project is called Till We Are Full. And it came out of kind of my own wrestlings with the complicated relationships that I've had with my body. And as a fat, mixed race, trans person, I was taught implicitly and explicitly to separate myself from my body. And that work pushes back against that. I print self-portraits onto fabric and other materials, and then I sew them into representations of my torso or my limbs, and then I'll stuff them with either rice or polyfill, and then I re-photograph myself interacting with those objects. And I, in that, kind of try to blur the lines between flesh and fabric and extend the idea of identity and body to everything and allow these two versions of my body to exist together. And so the kind of crux of that work is questioning the idea of an authentic body. And that principle is something that really guides me, especially as I turn my camera towards photographing other people and think about like the kind of pressure of representing someone else's body. And as someone who spent so much of my life being afraid of being perceived, but kind of not having a choice of whether I'm perceived, I know that it's rare and meaningful to have control over how you're seen and your own image. And so After All This Dying We Have Done, I'm creating a visual space for people to dictate how they want to be embodied. And in that way, this work is also about reinvention and refusal and imagining bodies on our own terms. And a big part of thinking about this work and thinking about talking about this work is that obviously I compare myself to other artists. And when I think about doing a project that's documenting a specific created social category, so like the idea of being non-binary, I feel a lot of the weight of history, the violence of typology, of anthropological surveys, and of images made about marginalized people rather than with them. And I'm constantly worried about making something that does more violence than good. But what I kind of hold on to challenge that fear is that I'm not making this work for anyone but myself and for the people in these images. It's not about extracting something, it's about sharing time and space and care, and it's just an added gift when people get to walk away with images of themselves that feel true to them. And I feel really proud of my ability to make portraits of people that they feel seen in, and I not just trying to capture like their face or their body, but the feeling of us being in relationship to each other. And so I want to share some behind the scenes info of the photo that I made of my sibling, Julian. Their image is the one on the farthest left. You'll see that they're holding the mascara wand and a little mirror compact and looking into it. Julian is a voice actor and a dungeon master and a writer and a streamer. And so a lot of their life focuses around performing. And in our conversation, we talked about them coming to performance as a place for experimentation and play and a way to act out possible identities and realities. And I asked them when they feel the most secure and which identities feel the most resonating with them. And they actually talked about being with their girlfriend, doing their makeup in their room, like before they go out or before a party. And the scene that they described was just the two of them. It was quiet. They like specifically mentioned being surrounded by soft light, and this kind of like joy and safety to them felt private and homey, and it was very warm. And something that they said in conjunction with that was that gender is a whisper. And I took that to mean that it's not the whole of them, but it's part of them that they are when they're alone, when it's quiet and tender, but still them speaking. And that phrase feels very kin to the heart of this project. It reminds me that being non-binary doesn't have to be loud or declarative to be real. Sometimes it's most true when it's small and safe and held in this intimacy. And that portrait, like so many in the series, is kind of a visual love letter to that like quiet resistance of just existing, and to those moments where we get to define ourselves on our own terms. And my family informs a lot of my artistic work in general. I have another body of work specifically dedicated to my family, and with the current political climate, I wanted to share a very different to my sibling but deeply related story about my father and how he came to the States. My dad is someone who has without fail pushed me and my sibling, maybe obviously, to pursue our artistic dreams. And he sacrificed a lot so that we could have the life that we do and pursue the things that we love. And I want to share a piece of his story because it feels deeply connected to how I think about resistance and care and the power that art can play, especially in this body of work and our current situation. So my father grew up in the Philippines. Like I said, he was the youngest of 5. He lost his father, my lolo, when he was just 9 years old, and so he grew up just with his mom. My father had a reputation as a kid for being very rebellious. He was not a rule follower. And as a teenager in the 1970s, he was coming of age, like turning 14 and 15, right as Ferdinand Marcos was tightening his grip on the country. And if you're not familiar with Ferdinand Marcos, he was a democratically elected president who quickly consolidated power. He filled the government with loyalists and declared martial law in 1972. And he claimed that it was to suppress communist rebellion, but in truth, it was to maintain control in the face of growing public unrest. And under martial law, civil liberties were suspended. There were widespread human rights abuses, including arrests and torture, forced disappearances of political dissidents. And at this time, my father was young and an artist and a performer, and he was watching authoritarian rule unfold literally from the time of his birth. And he started joining resistance groups and began performing at protests and rallies in Manila, doing street theater and music that was actively speaking out against and challenging the regime. And at 19, he was preparing to leave the city and join a guerrilla militia that was growing in the mountains, and his close friends at the time were being surveilled and arrested and disappeared. And my Lola, his mother, made a difficult choice and decided that it was time for them to go, and so she brought him to live in New York with my tita, his sister. My dad didn't want to leave, obviously, but he did, and once he got to New York, he did what I think a lot of us do when we feel displaced. He found art, and he found people. He sought out other Filipinos and performers and dreamers, and he built a life around connection and storytelling and music and care. And I think about that a lot when so many of us are asking, where is it safe to be ourselves? Where do we go when we need to rebuild? How do we find each other? And what does it mean to not give up? And that's what After All This Time has done for me. It's about building survival and joy with other people and keeping myself alive within that. And to end, I want to share that the title of the project comes from the book Vagabonds by Alongosa Sunde, and the full line that it comes from is, If anyone deserves to live, it is us. It is us after all this dying we have done. And I just wanted to thank Elle and Emily, and thank you guys for creating a space that centers joy and connection at a time when a lot of fear is being cultivated. And thank you, Madrone, and the staff of Gallery 1 and the city of Albuquerque. This residency gave me the space and time to be playful, to be comfortable, to make with joy, and that's something I don't take for granted. And thank you to everyone who has let me photograph them and has given time to this project. I'm grateful to exist with you. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Elliot Anderberg. I'm a quilter and the organizer of the Euphoria quilt, which is the big quilt behind us, and is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the Euphoria quilt is a queer and trans group quilt that is made of blocks sent to me by 166 different people from over 40 states and 5 countries. And that I sewed together to become this 11 feet by 12 feet behemoth behind you. So each of the blocks in this quilt answer the same question. The question is, what does your gender expansive joy look like? So any queer or trans person who related to that prompt, wanted to answer that prompt, was able to do so in the form of fabric. The only rule for submission was that it needed to be one of 2 sizes and that it be made of machine washable materials. So I landed on this project kind of under 2 avenues. The first being that in my own work, I'm very interested in joy as an aesthetic. The idea of what does joy look like, what aesthetic qualities delight us and why, and what does queer and trans joy look like, and is the answer to that question different than the answer to the question, what does joy look like? So I was thinking about that when the idea of the Euphoria quilt was born, and was thinking a lot about what if I could get other people to answer this question and help me try to answer this, to me, huge feeling question. The other avenue that I landed on this quilt from is how I think about quilts as a whole, kind of metaphorically, which is something that I've landed on both with learning quilt history and learning the history of quilting in my own family. So I started quilting without knowing that I had any ancestors who quilted, and learned a couple of years in that 4 of my great-great and great-great-great grandmothers were very prolific quilters. And when I ask people in my family who remember them, anybody who remembers them quilting, and when I ask them about that, they always bring up the fact that my grandmothers were quilting with other people, that they regularly gathered with their friends and their neighbors, and to work on the same quilt or to work on a couple of different quilts together. And if any of you have great-grandmothers or older who quilted, they certainly did the same thing. These events that quilters call quilting bees are as old as quilting themselves, and the reason that quilting has always been a collaborative art form. And it was in thinking about that and thinking about the fact that, to me, quilts are something that connect us. And they connect us in the moment, like they did for my grandmothers and their friends. But they also connect us through space and time, the way that I've been able to connect to my grandmothers through seeing their quilts and kind of meet them in that way. And so I think of quilts as something that connects us, and I think of them as archives. And that is, I wanted to make something that would connect us and something that was an archive, and it was through that the Euphoria quilt was born. So when I started the project, I thought I'd maybe get like 12 blocks, and then I got 50, and then I was like, can I get 100? And then I surpassed both of those goals, and then the quilt became 11 feet by 12 feet. And when I started this project, I knew I wanted to quilt the Euphoria quilt. So what that means is, it's a little hard to see because most of the quilted blocks are in the bottom of the quilt, but, okay, my little laser pointed. These little white stitches that you see on this block, for example, are quilting stitches. So that's something that has been added after this whole thing was sewn together. And it's a part of the process that joins the quilt top, which is what we see, with batting in the middle, which is what makes the quilt warm, with something onto the back. And quilting makes quilts really sturdy. And the reason that like many of us, or I don't know, I have quilts from my grandmothers that are like over 100 years old and they're still in amazing condition, and that's because they're quilted. So I really wanted this object to be quilted, but it was 11 feet by 12 feet, and how am I gonna pull that off became the next question. So I was listening to an interview between two quilters that I really admire, and they were talking about quilting bees, those events where people come together to work on quilts together, and how exactly what I was just saying, they are the reason quilting has always been a collaborative art form, and something that people really quilters love to point to as something that proves that quilting is this amazing community-oriented art form, which it is, but nobody throws quilting bees anymore, despite the fact that like everybody likes to point to them. And that's what they were talking about. And I was like, yeah, I've never been to a quilting bee. I really want to go to one. Maybe if I want to go to one, I have to throw one myself. And it was through this residency that I was able to travel with the quilt around to different places and hold quilting bees. And all of the little stitches that you see, or these ties, which you can see there up here, are things that have been added in those quilting bees, which I've done ones in Philadelphia, New York City, here, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Salt Lake City, Provo, and I'm missing 2 places, but you get the picture. And my plan is, I'm starting grad school this fall, but my plan is that next summer I'm gonna travel with the quilt again and go to the South and go to the Midwest. And at this point, I think that the process of coming together and quilting this object together has become so much a part of the product that I don't think I'm ever gonna finish this quilt. I think it's going to be in quilting process forever, which is convenient because it's huge and I have no idea how I would finish it, but also has now become philosophically important to the project. So now that I've kind of given you a background on what we're looking at, I want to look at some specific blocks and tell you about them, and kind of start to answer the question of what does queer and trans joy look like based on how other people have answered the question. So there are a few themes in the quilt that really stand out as things that a lot of people followed. The most obvious one is that most of the blocks in this quilt were improvised when they were made. So what that means is, like in traditional quilting, if you look at this block, for example, this is a very classic quilt block. And the person who made this block knew exactly what it was going to look like before they started and set out to make something that looks exactly like this. This yellow one below it, or this checkered one right here, were both made in a way where the person kind of made it up as they went. And so, like I said, a majority of the blocks here are improvised, and it was kind of half-half that I would get notes with them that either said, like, I improvised this on purpose because I've always done what's right for me with my queerness, and like that felt like a good metaphor, or the note said something like, I started this with a plan, but then the plan went out the window, and that felt like a really good metaphor for my gender. I got a lot of those. The second theme that I want to touch on, that as a quilt nerd I really love, is the traditional quilt blocks that appear in this quilt. So I'm going to pass around this poster that I made that shows just some of the traditional quilt blocks that are in the quilt, but you can see what their names were. A lot of people picked them because they thought the names had a double entendre or some kind of meaning. This one behind Claudia's head is a pattern that's called Wanderer in the Wilderness. And this one right here is actually a variation of that. And the person who made this one said that they made it because they picked it because of the name Wanderer in the Wilderness. It's also often called Drunkard's Path, but I like Wanderer in the Wilderness better, because they wanted to make something about the winding road of finding themselves as well as the winding road of physically transitioning. This block right here is a sawtooth star, which appears throughout the quilt a couple of times. One of my favorite notes that I got was from somebody who made a sawtooth star, who said that they picked it because despite it being a really exact pattern, they like it the wonkier it is. And that felt like a good metaphor for them. What else can I point to? This block right here is a pattern that's called Swamp Angel, which is just a really funny name. This block right here is 4 log cabins, which is what this block right here is as well. Log cabin is the most represented pattern in the quilt, and it's made by putting a square in the middle and then making it concentrically going out from there and making it larger and larger. So a lot of people who sent in log cabins said something like, I like this pattern because it feels like a hug or like an embrace. It feels like a comfort. What were other themes? Another block that you can't see because it's down here that I really like. The person picked it because it's called Birds in the Air. And they liked that it evoked togetherness and joy that comes from belonging to a flock. The other biggest theme, other than improvisation, was people using found materials. So at least half, if not more, I would say definitely more of the blocks in this quilt were made from, like, this sawtooth star I just showed you is made out of pillowcases, and the person that made it picked that on purpose because they wanted to pick a material that evoked comfort. There's a lot of denim in the quilt. This one, which I don't know that you can see down here, was made out of this front and lining of a particularly gender-affirming skirt for this person. And on the note of using found materials, some of my favorite notes that I got with the blocks were notes that said things like, I used materials that belonged to my grandmother or belonged to my great-great-grandmother, and that's somebody I never got to come out to, so it felt really nice to commune with them in this way. This block up here was one that came with that note. So, yeah, those are some stories behind some of the blocks. I could sit here and tell you more. Now this project is in a stage where we're building out an online archive. Claudia photographed all of the blocks that are in the quilt before I sewed them together. And we're on our website, which is euphoriaquilt.com. You will eventually be able to look through each of the blocks and sort them by tags, both like identity tags and tags like found materials or embroidered or like things like that. So that's what's next. But yeah, that's it.
And I think we have a little bit of time for questions, so if people have things they want to ask, we're happy to.
Excuse myself.
Or just comments, anything.
I have a question. For Emily, is there significance to why the badges are made of ceramic, or on this one as well as ceramic bits? Is that significant?
That's a great question. So the sort of art historical reference that I was thinking about are pilgrimage badges. So it used to be that you could buy these little tin badges that you would, as you went on religious pilgrimages throughout Europe, you would be given or purchase these little tin badges that you would then start to wear on your clothing, sort of as a mark of where you've been. And also, the more badges you had, it was almost more like you would have the wisdom to become a guide for those pilgrimages, right? And so each of the people who I worked with for this project had some sort of symbols that were meaningful to them, whether it's the fox or the bow or the sword. That felt like the mark of like their part of their pilgrimage that they had gone on. So I was sewing those on. I mean, part of the ceramic choice, of course, is that that's the material that I really know and love. But the other part of it is that it is sort of a long-lasting sort of, it becomes almost like a fossil, right? When you take the mud out of the earth and you put it through the kiln, you are truly transforming it into something permanent. And so that transformation is also part of the charms attached to the vests.
A question for Elle. For you, is there a relationship between the Euphoria quilt and the AIDS quilt? And if so, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it has to, it's a reference. It has to be a reference. I did do a decent amount of research about the AIDS quilt when I was thinking about this project. I think it's obviously a project that I really look up to. And I learned doing this that it is the largest community art project in the history of the world, the AIDS quilt is. If you didn't know, you can still add to it. You can still make panels that they're still collecting panels. I don't know. I wish I had more to say about the connection, and it's a reference. It's something that made me feel like, oh, I can do this, because it started in like a basement in San Francisco. And when I started this project, I felt really self-conscious about, and I still don't know like where this is going to end up and where I want it to end up. And I thought I had to know before I started it. And I'm really glad that I let myself start the project without knowing what the end goal was, because it's allowed the project to really grow with the goals of the project to grow alongside the project. And I think in many ways the AIDS quilt inspired me to do that. Yeah, because it was a project that they started without an end goal. Or with an end goal, but an unclear path to get there. Yeah.
What prompted your choice of printing on fabric?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fabric is something that I've experimented with printing on throughout grad school, and thinking about kind of the like queering of a photograph through changing its materiality and the way that we engage with it. And what I mean by that is just like the normal and traditional way that you see a photograph is on paper, and it's usually like framed and behind, and it's a lot more delicate. And the idea of printing on something that is, this is something that I've continually struggled to put words to, but something that is one thing that is made up of many things. Like if, like I'm like a knitter, and so I think about like knitting as being just like literally one string that is just like loops on loops on loops and loops, and these images are printed on silk, and so they're woven and they're literally just holding each other together. And something about like all the million tiny threads literally holding each other to be one thing felt very like, kind of like Ella described with the logs, that it feels like it's like a hug, that it's like doing this gesture of like holding. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, there's a self-portrait in there as well.
Yes.
Do you think you could speak a little bit to that?
Yeah,
And
for sure.
For
Yeah.
what that was like, you spoke to like collaborating and creating space with other folks,
Yeah.
but then sort of giving yourself that prompt
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Hazel was asking about the self-portrait in the work, which maybe you can notice. It's one of the smallest ones. and it's up next to, is the one with the red behind, if you can tell that that's me. And the process was honestly kind of different. Like, it came very instinctively and impulsively, and I was living with my friend Hope at the time, and I had this idea of like putting myself in beard drag and wearing lingerie and just being like literally hot and sweaty in the sun and in our backyard. And we had this broken frame that was sitting there, and I liked the idea of that as a shape on top of the bricks and being in the backyard. And it was all stuff that was very different than how I was creating the other ones, because with the other ones I was asking these people questions to understand what was going in their brain. But for creating my portrait, it was kind of just like, does that feel right? Nope. Does that feel right? Yes. And then like Hope had this red tool, and I was like, yes, that's the correct color. And it was all of these things that I wasn't like doing the same like note taking and like literal construction with, but it was happening like rapid fire in my brain. And I feel like that's a lot of how I work when I make self-portraits. It's very like, I feel like I get quiet and I lock in, and I'm just kind of like, yes, that's correct, or no, that's wrong. Yeah, and it was also, I mean, like even in the process, like Hope has oftentimes helped me focus, because they're all shot on film, and so it's really hard to be very precise with that. And so a lot of it was me setting up the frame, and then Hope would go sit, and then I would focus, and then I'd be like, okay, can you see like my face? And it was even just in that like a collaborative process, like with someone that I trusted to like similarly respect my body. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question, I think kind of for all of you, or whoever feels like they want to pick it up, about, like, maybe it's just as simple as it's like the relationship between fabric and travel and like distance, because all of you and your like backstory, and both of you physically, and like these pieces will travel out, they're about protecting during travel, you're traveling all over, having like this piece also traveling all over. So I'm just curious if that is something that any of you feel excited to talk about.
I mean, it is so cool to have something that like, it's huge, but it fits in a suitcase. And it's really nice that I can fold it all up, and that that makes it sturdy. Something about that makes it sturdy too. I don't know, do you guys have?
Like you were also talking about like the quilting action, making
Yeah.
it strong enough to survive, like being passed down.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. And also then like, because you're doing these quilting bees in places that you're traveling to, like as you keep traveling, it keeps getting stronger, which I feel like is really beautiful.
That's a nice metaphor.
Something that I've been using as a batting layer is the FedEx travel blankets. And you can actually see it through the like wound hole in the back of that blue quilt there. And so that travel blanket, as far as I understand it, is actually made of discarded textile remnants that are essentially like pressed together, probably in some chemical process, not sure. But it makes this really sturdy object that then does have that reference of like packing up your belongings to move to your next destination, your next part of your journey. I love those travel blankets. I don't think you're supposed to take them, but.
My thoughts aren't fully formed on that. I think it feels, yeah, kind of similar, that it's like it's sturdy, and it feels safer to have an image exist on fabric. Because I think of like, I mean, like as a photographer and working with prints and printers, like you get one scratch on a print and you're like, oops, this is worthless now, which I don't actually believe, but in a lot of art contexts, that is how it works. And so I think there's something honestly kind of like forgiving about the fabric, where like threads will be pulled, things will like pucker, there will be like stains on it, and that just feels like it's just like being more like allowing the fabric to keep existing.
Oh, I forgot to say in my talk that we're doing a quilting bee here
Oh, yeah.
on Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m. So you too can come add stitches to the quilt. No experience necessary. I will teach you how to hand quilt if you want to learn how to hand quilt, or you can add ties, which you only have to know how to tie a double knot to do that. And everyone is welcome. So
What time is it at?
1 to 4.
Cool.
Drop in, drop out vibes. Yeah.
Very cool.
I think that's a good ending
Yeah.
note. So thank you all so much.